If you have adult children and are divorcing, you might be surprised to learn that your adult children also experience the same grief and loss that you're going through. Your divorce can shake their foundation as well. So listen in as Linda Hershman, a licensed marriage and family therapist, shares the significant impact on adult children of divorcing parents, and she's going to give us some steps you can take to ease that transition. This is the Silver Divorce Podcast, broadcast from the Whitfield Media Group studios in Chattanooga, Tennessee, proudly brought to you by our title sponsor, the Center for Sports Medicine and Orthopedics, and show sponsor, Medicare Misty. Center for Sports Medicine and Orthopedics is the area's leading provider of multi-specialty orthopedic care using innovative surgical techniques and technologies. Our team of specialists deliver exceptional results backed by exceptional patient care. Learn more at sportmed.com. Medicare Misty is a real person who can help answer your Medicare questions. Get real help from her team at MedicareMisty.com. And I'm your host, Lisa McCluskey. And before we start, I have an ask of you all. If you have been listening to this podcast, maybe following the Facebook page, I really would like to have some input. I'd like to hear what topics you're interested in. What are your concerns? What should we be addressing on this show? And I'd love to do a questionnaire. So if you're willing to help me make this show better, I'd ask you to email me at silverdivorcepodcast@gmail.com, and I will send you a questionnaire. It won't be long, and I promise you I will not spam you. You will not end up on some email list. I will not sell your information, but I really just would like to have your input to help make this show better and to meet your needs more closely. So now, let's podcast. Well, as I mentioned, on the line with me is Linda Hershman. Linda is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She has been in practice for 30 years. She also wrote what is really kind of considered the main book for Gray Divorce, and it's titled Gray Divorce, Everything You Need to Know About Later Life Breakups. So welcome, Linda.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa.
Yeah, I'm excited that you're joining me because, we don't often think that our adult children will be affected by our divorce. We think their life is just going to go on as normal, but that's really not the case. So I'm so glad that you can be here to help break that down for us and give us some real strategies for managing.
I'm so glad that you are interested in addressing this topic because it is too often ignored.
Yeah, it can be emotionally challenging for children. I found that with my adult children. Even after it was over, they told me, that your divorce wasn't just hard on you, it was hard on us too. So a lot of times they're raising their own families. And so they start to think, well, what about my family? What's going to happen to my family if this can happen to my mom and dad? And we thought you were solid. We had no idea. And then also, they may already have issues with their relationships with, mom or dad. And now this is going to strain those relationships even further. And then they can have some unresolved issues stemming from their childhood and their teen years, maybe. Maybe they went through a rocky period with their parents, and it just throws everybody for a loop and really exacerbates their feelings of grief and loss. So I'm hoping to address all of these, but before we start, I'd really like to have you share with the listeners how you came to focus on Gray Divorce and later life breakups.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I have always written, but most of my professional writing has been for magazines, local newspapers, short work kinds of things. And I had started to notice in my own private practice how many of my clients age 50 plus were divorcing or divorce questioning. And let me just start with the definition of gray divorce, which I did not create, is divorce over age 50. And also, to put out two fun facts for you, 33% of married couples age 50 and over are divorcing, and that number is expected to continue rising. And 66% of gray divorces are initiated by women. So you are looking at a third of all married couples over 50 are probably going to go through a gray divorce. And so I was noticing that, and I was starting to think about the differences between divorce in later life and before age 50. And we're not taught in grad school and therapist training programs to look at divorce that way. And so I became really curious. I started doing a lot of research. I got a chance to do a presentation at a conference in Scotland in 2019. And as I was parlaying my 3-day conference into a road trip around Scotland and Ireland, I got a call from a publisher, and they said, "We heard your presentation. Have you considered writing a book?" And I said, "I hadn't thought about it, but if you're calling me, I guess I better consider it."
Right.
And it turned out I ended up not using the publisher, but self-publishing for reasons that aren't germane to this discussion. But as part of the process, I had to submit a proposal, and part of the proposal was to research the market competition. And what I found when I began to do the research is there were lots of books about gray divorce out there. There is this seminal book called Gray Divorce, which is written by two sociologists, and it's about 700 pages of statistics. And then there were niche books. There were books written by financial planners. There were books written by attorneys. There were books of stories, people surviving and thriving after gray divorce. And then there were what I called the Girlfriend's Guide to Gray Divorce books, which were written by women whose husbands typically left them for younger women. And the tone of the book was, "Hey, girlfriend, I'm going to show you how to survive and thrive and make him regret that he ever left you." What was not out there was anything comprehensive, anything that took into consideration the entire family system, and anything that offered real solutions to the emotional, parenting, legal, and financial challenges of gray divorce. And so I realized I have my book. So that's how it began. It began because I wanted to take a road trip through Scotland and Ireland.
Oh, well, I have read your book, and it really does provide a comprehensive view. And also, I was really intrigued by how you broke out the different types of therapy. Because when you're talking about therapy, people think, all therapy is the same. And if you have one, it applies to all. But they're really just very specific types of therapy that apply to specific situations. And I found that really intriguing as you're trying to work with varying levels of people in gray divorce and in certain family situations.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing that resonated with you, that made sense.
Yeah, I had no idea. Wow, it was really eye-opening. So it was a great book. I highly recommend it. And that's why I was very excited to have you on today. Not only do you have 30 years of experience working with families, but you have such a deep history and knowledge of how gray divorce has evolved over the years. So let's get down to those adult children. And it's so hard. It's so complex. And I know in my divorce, I probably didn't handle it as well as I could have. Now that I know a lot more than I did then, I would have handled things a lot differently. But Can you just start and talk about what are some of the unique challenges that adult children of a divorce face, and how is that different from the younger children of a marriage?
I would love to. First of all, let me just say that there is an acronym, ACODS, ACODS, Adult Children of Divorce. So as we're having our conversation and I'm referring to the ACODS, everybody will know what I'm
Okay.
talking about. And there is a concept that was developed by a psychologist named Pauline Boss called ambiguous loss. Ambiguous losses are those that are not generally recognized by society as losses, that are not typically validated, and that don't have rituals to mark the transition periods. And when and some of the different types of ambiguous losses are things like when you have a loved one who has Alzheimer's, and so they're there, but they're not really there anymore. Or they're in addiction. They're there, but they're not really there anymore. Or adoption can be an ambiguous loss. There are many of them, and that's not the topic of this, but the point of bringing this up is that for ACODs, their parents' divorces can be an ambiguous loss. There is this presumption by society and by the parents that the children are adults, they have their own lives, they have their own families, they can deal with this and basically suck it up and move on.
You know, wow, now that you say that, I can see where people wouldn't even consider the adult children. You know, my parents are getting divorced. They wouldn't consider that they're going through trauma too. That it's just like you said, well, get over it, suck it up, and things will be different. So,
Right. And when you have younger children, most parents these days, I think, do everything they can to try and prepare and protect the children. They sit down and they read them books. They talk with them about what things are going to look like. They assure them this is not your fault. You had nothing to do with this. But when have you ever heard of an older parent sitting down with their ACOD and saying, let me read you a book to help you handle your dad's and my divorce?
right. And,
Right?
or even to consider that one of your adult children may feel guilt or they have some sort of blame for your divorce. That wouldn't even occur to many parents. It never occurred to me that that might happen.
Exactly. And the greatest risk for ACODs developing that sense of guilt and responsibility are in situations where their parents' marriages were low conflict, where the parents seemed to get along really well, they transacted well, they did lots of things as a family. On the surface, everything looked just fine, and yet the parents were not experiencing the marriage in the most romantic way possible, or, it wasn't the marriage they wanted anymore. And when they communicate the message to their adult children that, well, we stayed together for your sake, think about that for a minute.
And you read that a lot, where people stay until the kids are off to college or the kids are out of the house. Right. And the kids thought their parents had a perfect marriage. They never, as you said, they never saw conflict. And then suddenly that bomb is dropped. Well, we only stayed together for you. That must be a tremendous burden on that adult child.
It's a huge burden on that child. And imagine giving your child that sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
That we stayed together, we were not living our best lives, but we did it for you.
Wow, that's a heavy guilt trip right there.
yes, it is a very heavy guilt trip.
Yeah. Wow, that's a whole different way of looking at it. So some of the family dynamics, they also shift in some unhealthy ways when the parents divorce. Can you talk about that? What have you seen in the family dynamics when parents are divorcing?
Sure. And another one of the issues that can develop and oftentimes does develop is because parents see their children as adults, they tend to forget that they're still their children. And so they tend to confide in their ACODs in ways that are not healthy and not appropriate. And again, can create guilt, can put the child in the adult child in the middle, can breed situations where the ACOD feels like they have to choose loyalty, and it is not healthy for them. And one of the things I always say to parents who are divorcing or divorce questioning is your child looks like an adult, they act like an adult, they live like an adult. However, they are still and always your child, and do not give them information that would not be appropriate to give to a young child.
That's really good advice, because I can say that when you see someone who I've seen when there is a marriage that appears to be a good marriage, then the person who's leaving decides to leave. They don't want to be seen as the bad guy or the evil villain. And so they will try to tell the children stories that aren't true. They will try to make up things so that the children can feel like, oh, well, this person had a reason for leaving. And it seems to really create not only a rift between the parents, but it puts that other parent in the position of feeling as though they have to defend themselves. So when your spouse is telling the kids things that aren't true because they don't want to appear to be the bad guy, how do you handle that? Should you be defending yourself? Should you just stay quiet? What is the best solution for that?
Well, again, another one of my laws of Linda is you should always love your children more than you hate your ex.
Oh, that should be a sign. You should be always love your children more than you hate your ex. I love that.
Yeah. And so it's hard to counter. I mean, hopefully there are a lot of things you have done along the way that will mitigate some of these problems, like not triangulating your children, like not saying bad things about your ex, like not bringing them into situations where they don't belong, like having appropriate boundaries. Because if you haven't done that, it's really hard after 30 or 40 years to all of a sudden start setting boundaries, and yet it is the best thing for your children and ultimately for yourself too.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting when you talk about people making up things. One of the reasons that gray divorce has risen so much is because of no-fault divorce being legal in all 50 states and Canada, and also required in many states. Before no-fault divorce, when you wanted to divorce, you had to have grounds.
Mm-hmm.
And there were 7 approved grounds. I never remember all of them, but they're things like abuse, addiction, adultery, abandonment, and a couple more, but you get the gist. They are really, really severe things. And so if you wanted a divorce, you often had to make up grounds for the divorce and go into court and swear in public court and have it go on a record. And that discouraged many, many, many people from getting divorced because they didn't want to put their children in situations where they had to say, this is what your father did to me, or this is what your mother did.
Mm-hmm.
And so, basically, if you start telling stories, then you're going back to the old days when divorce was a public, nasty, horrible spectacle.
Right. It's more,
Yeah, in terms of what you do or not do, hopefully you've established that relationship with your ACOD where they know you, and the probably most kind and validating and non-defensive thing you can do is not to go onto the attack, not to get too defensive, but to say, you're hearing one story, and if you think about situations in your life where somebody must have said something about you and there's another side to the story, maybe you can understand that you're not seeing the whole picture.
Yeah, that's a great response. You're not going on the attack, but you're encouraging them to think about there is more than one side to a story, and you may not be getting the full story. And
exactly.
I can recall one particular incident where, my daughter relayed a story that was being told, and she said to me, that just didn't sound like you. And I didn't have to say anything. It was, you stay true to your character and who you are. And it may not, if it doesn't sound like you, then you don't have to worry about that story being told. So I like that. That's good advice. So a lot of times, though, in gray divorce, and I think I read almost 60% of the time, there is an affair partner involved. And that becomes a whole new scenario and situation because as the person who's being left for an affair partner, you have a lot of anger. And how can you give us some guidance on when a divorce is caused by an affair partner? How do you handle that with your kids? Do you leave that to your other spouse who's leaving to explain that situation? Or how does that dynamic work in gray divorce?
Well, let me first of all give a little bit different context on this. While an affair might precipitate a gray divorce, it's generally not the reason for it. Affairs don't necessarily break up marriages. There are typically long-standing patterns and problems that were not addressed or not addressed well enough, and the affair becomes the death knell.
Oh.
So I think we need to be aware that an affair, more often than not, I'm not saying it never happens, but an affair more often than not is a symptom and not a cause of a marriage ending.
No. Yeah, I would say that's true. It is somebody, unless you are, there are instances where there's somebody who has a sex addiction or there are serial cheaters, but oftentimes there are a lot of problems in the marriage happening before that person has an affair.
And what I would say to that is if somebody has a sex addiction or is a serial cheater, that speaks to a lot of problems in the marriage. I mean, not on the betrayed person's end in terms of feeding into that, but these are not things that typically just pop up at age 50 or 60.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what I'm saying. There are a lot of things in the marriage that may not have been dealt with all along. And so the affair is the straw that broke the camel's back. And I think, and again, I'm not giving anybody a pass on this. I am not in favor of affairs or ending a marriage as the result of an affair. I just hope that the betrayed person will also keep in mind that the affair partner may necessarily have not come into it knowing the whole story, the real story. And by the time they find out that this person they're involved with is married and maybe having sexual relations with their spouses and still living as a family, they might be in so deep that it's hard for them.
Mm.
And now, of course, there are plenty of situations where both affair partners know what they're getting into. But the point is, it takes two people to have an affair. And so you want to be very careful not to put all your blame and all your hate on the other partner, on the other person rather. Because that's not going to get you anywhere. It's not going to do you any good. And again, by the time an affair happens, you've probably had a lot of problems down the line that you haven't been addressing. And so just look at the whole context of the relationship. I strongly encourage anybody who's going through a major life transition like a divorce at any age to have the support of a good therapist who will be objective and will support you, will give you the help and the tools to get through it, and who also will ask you to look at what you may have brought in, you know, whether it was enabling or denying or certain interactions that you can work on going forward so that you don't end up in another relationship that mirrors the first relationship.
And that makes a lot of sense. So then when you are in that position of your spouse has had an affair and if your kids, your adult children are very angry with that spouse and they would be more likely to take sides and split the family any further. So, and you're feeling angry yourself, how do you approach that situation? How do you sit down and have conversations with them? And what can you say to try to keep things together a little bit?
Well, your anger is valid. You are entitled to your feelings, and quite frankly, anger is what gets people through divorce. Mm. Anger, placed appropriately, serves as momentum to move forward. But you can certainly let your children know, yes, I'm angry and hurt. However, I'm talking to a therapist about this. I'm seeking support. You know, I have a divorce group. I'm seeking support. I have the support of my friends, and I encourage you to get some good objective support to help you through it. And when you're ready, this is your relationship to work out with your other parent. And I'm here to support you, but I'm not going to feed into it with you.
Got an injury that just can't wait? There's no need to delay your care. Center for Sports Medicine and Orthopedics is excited to announce that our Urgent Ortho Walk-In Clinic is now available on Saturdays at the Gun Barrel Road location. Open from 8 to noon, we're here to treat sprains, strains, fractures, and more. No appointment needed. So skip the long ER wait and get specialized orthopedic care fast. Visit us this Saturday at Center for Sports Medicine and Orthopedics Urgent Ortho. We're the center for expert care right when you need it. Learn more at sportmed.com.
Yeah, so would you recommend that maybe the children join the parent in a therapy session? Would you find that beneficial?
Are you talking about the parent who betrays, who has the affair partner?
No, the parent who has been betrayed. And even in other divorce cases where there hasn't been an affair partner. Is that helpful to fostering communication to have maybe a therapy session with the children?
Well, I think it can be very, very, very helpful. Again, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and what distinguishes our training from therapists who only work with individuals is that we have a very systemic orientation. We recognize the impact of the whole system on each person in the system. And so if I'm sitting in a room with one person, in my mind, I've got systems behind us that I have to consider too. What my client is bringing into it and what they are bringing to my client. So it's not a linear process. But I think if you are going to work with the family system, you need to make sure you're working with a therapist who really, like an LMFT, who understands systems work, because you don't want the therapy to be the betrayed parent and the ACOD sitting in therapy just blaming the other parent.
Yeah.
That's not effective.
That could make it worse.
But also, I do want to say that family therapy is a really great idea when one or both are having problems. The parent and the ACOD are having problems setting or keeping boundaries. If you are an ACOD and one of your parents is triangulating you or trying to draw you into it in some way or another, working with a family therapist to help set boundaries and to help the parent hear the boundaries can be extremely useful. And conversely, there is this concept called secondary gain, and secondary gain refers to the reasons to maintain a problem. And oftentimes, ACODs have secondary gain in being treated like a confidant and a peer. It makes them feel useful and important. And so ACODs may also try to insert themselves where they necessarily shouldn't be. And when that's the case, going to family therapy to help with those boundaries can also be extremely helpful and productive.
Yeah, I can see that where an ACOD is a confidant, then suddenly that gives them a little bit more power over the other ACODs in the family. It's almost as though they've become the chosen one. And that can be a very strange family dynamic.
Right, and also a very powerful role.
Right, yeah. Yeah, they feel as though they have influence and importance because they've been chosen to be the confidant.
Mm-hmm.
So, wow, that's interesting. So, I know you've mentioned boundaries several times. So, what are some of the common boundaries? Just lay out for me what some of them should be.
Well, some of the common boundaries that the parents can set are, as we've talked about, I'm not going to give you a lot of gory details here. This is not something that this is between the two of us, and we will take care of it. Another boundary a parent can set is not trash talking the other partner. And also learning to be independent. And I am speaking a lot to women here because when we're talking about women over 50, especially when they're over 60 and 70 and they are getting divorced later in life after being married their whole lives, oftentimes they have not been involved with the family finances. They haven't learned to use a computer. They haven't learned to take care of a lot of the household things. And so they lean on their adult children to help with that. But there's a difference between helping and doing. And so as I would encourage anybody who, whether you're seeing a great divorce coming or not, to take responsibility to be able to manage your life, to be able to use a computer, to know what the finances are, to be able to handle the kinds of tasks that you'll need to handle if you're widowed down the road. And so those are some of the things the parents can do. And they can, again, validate. You always want to validate your children's feelings. You don't have to agree with them, but you can validate, I get that you are feeling this way. You are entitled to feel this way, and maybe you should be speaking with a therapist. Maybe you should be getting some more objective support. And for the ACODs, and this is really tough to do, Lisa, because, again, they're still your parents, and so they still are up on the hierarchy over you,
Mm-hmm.
We always see our parents as having some kind of power and authority over us, no matter how old we get. And so work with a therapist if you need to be able to start saying, I need to set limits on how much time I can spend with you, or I am not willing to listen to you trash talk my other parent. When you're ready to talk about something else, let's have a conversation. And different things like that.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful because it's on both sides. The parent has to have boundaries, and then the child has to have their own boundaries as well in order to be effective. And I wanted to go back to something that you said about learning to be independent. I chuckled a little bit because, suddenly you find yourself in your house and, you're learning how to fix things. And I would imagine, I don't have a son. If I had had a son, it might have been very tempting to call him every time I needed to have something screwed in or fixed or cut a piece of wood or whatever it was I needed to do, and almost make them a pseudo husband. So I think that would be something that would be easy to do, but there's a great deal of satisfaction in learning to do all of that on your own. And yeah.
Yeah, and even even if learning how to fix things is not satisfying for you, it's still the right thing to do as much as you can. Again, your children do have their own lives, and they should be entitled to their own lives and not become surrogate spouses to you.
Right. Yeah.
And Lisa, if I could just walk back for a second to something you said at the beginning of our conversation. You had mentioned about parents divorcing when their children go off to college or are getting ready to move out of the house.
Right.
And if I had $1 for every time I heard a couple say, well, we're just going to stay together until the kids go off to college, I could be retired now. But I am here to tell you that that is the worst time to divorce. And the reason for that is because and of course, I want to sort of apologize. I know this is coming from a more privileged place, and I know there are many, many, many adult children who are not going to go to college for various reasons. So, but just looking at that under a microscope for a second, when a child is going off to college, that is a time for them to learn to individuate, to be on their own. It might be the first time they've ever really been away from home, assuming they're going away. And it may be the first time they've had an opportunity to meet people who are different from the ones they grew up with. It's the first time they're exposed to all kinds of new thoughts and ideas. And to really start to figure out who they are, who they want to be when they move fully into adulthood. And when they first go off to college and you hit them with, oh, and by the way, we're getting divorced, it does not give them the opportunity to individuate because they have one foot in their new world and they still have one foot back in their old world, where they're worrying about things like, are my younger siblings okay? Are my parents okay? Where am I going to sleep when I come home for Christmas vacation? Do my parents have some kind of custody thing they expect me to comply with? And so when I have divorce questioning individuals or couples in and they say, oh yeah, my kids are in 9th and 11th grade and we're just waiting until the older one goes to college, I say, okay, you may want to consider either doing it now while they're home and you can support them and work through this transition with them in the healthiest way possible, or wait a couple of years until they have more of a sense of who they are apart from the family.
Yeah, that makes so much sense because going off to college is a whole new level of stress for these kids. As you mentioned, they're trying to navigate a new community and they're trying to figure out who they are and what they want to be. And many of them aren't even quite sure what career path they want to be on. And then suddenly, if they're hit with the divorce of their parents and they're spending time worrying about that, that's almost too much for somebody who's only maybe 19, 20 years old.
Right, it is too much.
Yeah.
And the other thing I want to say, when we talk about our children, we tend to think about and how our children are going to react, because that's a really common question I get. How are my children going to react? And what I remind people is your children are not an aggregate. If you have 3 children, they probably have 3 different personalities, and they handle things in 3 different ways, and they take in information differently. And so you might have one child who says, well, it's about time. I don't know why you didn't do this sooner. You might have another child who says, this is the worst thing that ever happened. I can't believe you're doing this. And then you might have a third child who says, okay, and I'm late for the movies.
Right.
So make sure when you are communicating with your children that you are seeing each of your children for who they are and how they handle things in the world. And by 18 or 20 or 30 years old, hopefully as a parent, you have a good idea how your child reacts to things.
Yeah. Well, what I'm hearing from this entire conversation is that you can't leave your adult children to figure it out on their own. You have to have a plan for how you are going to tell them, the boundaries that you're going to set, and how you navigate throughout the entire divorce process. It can't just be they're just out there and they're going to manage it on their own. You have to be very intentional and deliberate about how you're going to relate to your adult children through divorce.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So let me ask you this. In all of your years of working with people in great divorce, is there a person who particularly moved you, a story that just made an indelible impression on you?
I can't talk about specific cases because of confidentiality. However, I find that the most moving and heartbreaking cases are when one spouse comes out or transitions in later life, and
Yes.
the other spouse not only is dealing with a great divorce, but it brings up myriad questions of, did this person ever really love me? Was our whole marriage a lie? Why didn't I know about this? Why didn't I see this? And it's just heartbreaking. And while I think it's wonderful that society has evolved to a point where younger people now are not marrying opposite sex partners because it's the only way they can see to have a family, to get a job, to get a promotion, to live a quote unquote normal life. And I use that word very loosely. At the same time, oftentimes when somebody comes out or transitions in later life, the message now is, this is great, this is wonderful. They get to be their genuine, authentic selves. They can finally have the life they want to live, and it does not take into account what that is doing to the spouse in this process. They're expected to be happy that their spouse is finally free to live the life they want. But like I said, what does that say about the last 25, 30, 40 years?
Oh, wow. That's almost a whole nother episode we can do on that topic.
Believe me, I have
think.
a whole episode on mixed orientation marriage and divorce. But yeah, I find those cases to be the most heartbreaking because it's not just the grief of a divorce.
Yeah.
It's the grief of finding out that your partner is not who you thought they were. And all the adjustments around that. And again, that speaks to the ACODs too, who all of a sudden have to consider the possibility that I thought this is what my parents' marriage was like, but it turns out that my father is gay, or, whatever the situation is.
Yeah, I would
It
think.
just creates an extra level of grief and of things to work through. And one recommendation I have, certainly in this situation, but in any gray divorce situation, if you as a spouse or as an ACOD are going for therapy, you can ask a therapist questions before you start working with them. And it's really important to ask, what is your familiarity with gray divorce? Can you tell me how gray divorce differs from divorce in earlier years? And if the therapist can't answer those questions, then keep looking.
That's good advice. Yeah, because ultimately the therapist is working for you. So you want to make sure that their background and their education is appropriate for what you're going through.
Absolutely.
Just like in your book, when you explained the different types of therapy and what they're used for. That's an important distinction.
And the other thing I will just say to ACODs, if you're listening, is most ACODs, when they do go into therapy, they don't go into therapy to talk about their parents' divorces. Again, they've internalized this message that, well, I'm an adult, I can handle it and move on. But they do often go in because they have trust issues, because they have relationship issues, and which they don't directly connect to their parents' divorce. So if you as an ACOD are going into therapy, don't be shocked if you end up having to deal with your parents' divorce in a way you didn't realize you had to.
That's good advice. Okay. Well, it's such a deep topic, and I'm really glad that you came on to talk about it. So, Linda, what's inspiring you today?
Travel.
Yes, you mentioned Ireland. Yes.
Well, my husband and I, who are both seniors, are on a mission to see as much of the world as we can while we can, the way we like to do it. And so, yeah, we have been doing a lot of traveling, and we've got a couple of really big trips coming up. And yeah. And the other thing that is inspiring me is I want to work on an update to Gray Divorce, Everything You Need to Know About Later Life Breakups, because the stats have changed since I wrote the book. When I started writing the book, it was 25% of couples. Now it's 33%. And I have become aware of a couple of other issues in gray divorce that are not in my book that I want to include in an update. And I also want to write a book on my partner won't go to couple therapy, what next?
Ah, that's a good
So
one. Yeah.
those are the two things inspire me right now.
Wonderful. Well, I can't wait for you to release those 2 books. That's wonderful. So I do thank you for joining me today, Linda. Would you share with our listeners how we can get in touch with you, your website, if you have social media?
Sure. The best way to, if you want information about the books, the ebook you can buy on Amazon, but the paperback is through bookbaby.com. But if you go onto my website, which is lindahershman.com, LindaHershman.com, it will give you the links for ordering the books. And I generally run a promo for a discount on the paperback book through my website. Well, the code is through my website. And you can contact me through there. And you can also start following me on Facebook at Gray Divorce Book.
Okay. And I'll put all those links in the show notes for people. And when I post this episode on the Silver Divorce Podcast Facebook page, I'll put links to it all there as well. So we can find you. Well, this has been, such a deep topic, so challenging with the adult children, but I think you've helped shed some really good light on setting boundaries and why people feel the way that they do. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
Good. Well, for our listeners, please join me on the next episode of the Silver Divorce Podcast. And before you go, I ask for you to hit that subscribe button, share the podcast, and leave us a rating and a review. That does help to grow the podcast and attract great guests like Linda. So this podcast is brought to you by our title sponsor, the Center for Sports Medicine and Orthopedics, and show sponsor, Medicare Misty. Center for Sports Medicine and Orthopedics is the area's leading provider of multi-specialty orthopedic care. Using innovative surgical techniques and technologies, our team of specialists deliver exceptional results backed by exceptional patient care. Learn more at sportmed.com. And Medicare Misty is a real person who can help answer your Medicare questions. Get real help from her team at medicaremisty.com. Whether you are considering divorce or are newly in the divorce process, we'll help you on your journey and tell you things your attorney might not tell you. Until next time, remember, divorce is an event. It does not define who you are. I'm Lisa, and I'll see you next time.